And we are live now, Scott. And I don't have the link yet. There's the link. And we are going to give this a shot for this live show in our Discord.
Let's do it. Let's try out this new YouTube activity
so YouTube
thing.
Watch. Search results. Here it is. Oh, look at that. So I don't know what you see. How does this show for you?
It shows exactly, well, it shows in a similar way for me because I'm a host. Let's do it.
Oh, so if you expand video, there you go.
Then it just takes up the whole thing. Yep.
All right. So if people want to watch this in the future, when we continue to go live, we can try to give people more of a heads up. But they can head over to the cloud live show channel to watch our YouTube live stream. There we go.
And then you just need to remember to mute the YouTube channel too if you're going to leave Discord open.
Yeah, switch.
So you don't echo back through yourself.
Do you hear an echo in there? I think everything's muted. There should not be an echo going through there.
Unless I'm hearing your desktop audio out of something.
I don't know. Oh, there you go. I bet that was it. Did that fix it? I believe.
Maybe. I don't know.
Hopefully. I think you
we'll
were
give it a
hearing
second
my
and we'll see.
desktop audio. I had some desktop audio on that I think was feeding back. All these weird audio loops that we can create by making sure everything is live and all of that.
Yeah. Yep. We'll see how it goes.
All right. I think I got it fixed. Hopefully my bandwidth will survive and we'll be good to go. So, Scott.
So, Ben.
Would you like to talk about Azure Automation today? And particularly some new, it's kind of like new features that came to Azure Automation, as well as some new features that came to Exchange PowerShell, and some, I would say, interesting things you need to do if you want to kind of combine, not Azure PowerShell, Exchange PowerShell. I don't know what I actually said. Some interesting ways you can combine
You'll get there.
I'll get there. To run some scripts. So I'm going to jump over. We'll just jump right into the documentation here. So Azure Automation. Have you played with Azure Automation, Scott? Do you still do much with this? Have you ever done much?
I do less with it today than I used to in the past. I think generally as I start to get into more like data-driven things, I tend to be working over in maybe something like a Synapse or a Data Factory over an Azure Automation. But I still like to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I still like to think about Azure Automation as a cron server that runs as a service. And it just happens to be able to execute things like PowerShell, or you can kind of kick off other automations within Azure. So maybe call like a webhook, do the equivalent of like curl requests, things like that. But it's got some other niceties to it. Like you can kind of import your own PowerShell modules into or run kind of versions of PowerShell modules that you need to within your own Azure Automation instance. It has these things called run as accounts. So it can run in the context of a service principal and go out and execute things on your behalf within your environment. It supports managed identity, both system assigned and user assigned. So it's just this really cool way to go ahead and say like, okay, I have something that I want to execute on a schedule or on demand, really doesn't matter, but I tend to think of it as kind of scheduled things. And where do I want to affect that change? It can be on-prem. I've primarily used it as Azure. And then what's the thing that you want to do? Like, oh, I want to go run this logic app when this thing runs, or I want to go run this PowerShell script. Maybe I want to go kick off a backup, something like that. sky's kind of the limit for it. It's a pretty nifty service.
It is, and you kind of hit the highlights. And I was gonna go look. I don't know if it's in the what's new. This one I saw the other day. It does support PowerShell 7.2. I believe run as accounts. Yeah, run as accounts as of July are actually going away. Um, so those are going to retire now, a little less than a year from now. Um, and managed identity is replacing those. So like run as used to be how you would run accounts as identities, and now they're kind of going all go do it all with managed identity instead of these run as accounts.
I think that's a good thing. Run as accounts potentially had some issues before. Like you needed elevated permissions to create a run as account. And really, what you were doing is when you provisioned a run as account, you were giving that service principal some crazy rights within your directory. I think it was like owner rights within the subscription where the Azure automation account is provisioned. It was a pretty high level, like almost super userist thing within the subscription context that it got deployed in. So that's probably not a bad thing that those are kind of going away and being deprecated out for things like managed identities.
Yeah, I agree. And managed identities. So there's all this documentation. We'll go put it in the show notes. These are a nice, I would say a nice feature. I like these in Azure. I'm glad to see like Azure Automation supporting them more. And there's two different types of these, right? You have the system assigned managed identity where you really just click a button and it goes and creates this managed identity in the background. Or you can do user assigned where you can go create a managed identity within Azure. Like there's the whole, if you go search for resources, you can find managed identities and go create your own and then assign this managed identity to a resource. And like you said, it's essentially creating a service principal that supports Azure AD authentication. So you have different services like Key Vault is one, and even now some of the PowerShell that you run within uh, Azure Automation, maybe you want that to essentially log in with Azure AD authentication. You can now use these service principals, these managed identities, to go access other services as this account in an Azure AD authentication supported manner. I guess is probably a good way to say it.
Yeah, so I think it's helpful with managed identities to maybe take a step back and think about what they really are. So can you pull up your Azure AD?
My Azure AD, yes, I can do that.
Yep. Yeah. So you're in your Azure Active Directory tenant. And if you search for a managed identity in here, like you're just going to search across your tenant,
Yep.
you'll see that they actually manifest as applications within your directory. So, in a very similar way that a service principal would go ahead and come across. At the end of the day, a managed identity is a service principal. Like it's this, it's got an application ID, it's got a client secret, like all these kinds of things that you're used to from working with service principals. But the big difference is it's created on your behalf. And the reason it's called managed is because it's managed within the context of the thing that created it. So if I create a virtual machine and I say, go provision a managed identity for this virtual machine, in the background, ARM's going to reach out to Azure AD. It's going to do a new enterprise app registration for you. And then when you do things like you can grant that managed identity permissions within your environment, and then say you're done with the virtual machine. So you go ahead and you delete it and it goes away, then it automatically manages that lifecycle for you too, and that managed identity gets cleaned up. So they're nice like that in that the entire lifecycle end to end of them is managed. They can be granted through identity and access management. They can be granted and given roles within your environment. So you can say like, hey, I've got this MI for this VM, and maybe I'm going to go make it a contributor on a resource group over here because it's going to manage resources and spin up and spin down VMs that can't be in VM scale sets yet, something like that, right? You just go down some path along the way. So they're pretty cool in that sense. Like, hey, enterprise app registration, fully managed, all good to go. I can grant it RBAC, all those kinds of things. Everything's cleaned up for me. But you do have to be cognizant of that life cycle. There's potentially some caveats to how they differ from a user assigned managed identity. So when you're going into a service, like in this case, we're going to talk about Azure Automation. You go into Azure Automation and you go down to your identity. The first tab is going to be the
Yep. Here, and I
system
can
assigned.
jump
Yep.
over there a minute. So I go over to Azure Automation, intelligent demo. So that managed identity, it was system assigned. It usually gets created or always gets created with the same name as the resource that you're creating it in.
Correct. You don't
Is
have
another
control
thing.
over that.
So,
Like you're just gonna go and turn it on for the most part. And that's okay. Like you're
yep.
you're saying, hey, Azure, I want you to manage the life cycle of this thing for me. So it's like an on-off button. But there's maybe some, depending on your use case, there could be some downsides to system assigned managed identity. So you look at these two things and you go like, well, how do I know when to use one or the other? How do I rationalize that? So one of the big differences is that lifecycle is managed. So if you envision this identity being granted access to multiple places in your environment, and the resource that was associated with the identity at first could be dynamic, like in this case, it's an Azure Automation instance, but let's pretend it was a VM. VMs come and go, servers is cattle and all that jazz. So you might want the identity to persist beyond the life cycle of the resource itself. So in that case, you can do user assigned managed identities or those service principals. You can create them once. You're responsible for managing the life cycle. The other good thing, potentially, good thing, bad thing, depends on, again, your life cycle and what you want to do with things, is user assigned managed identities can be shared across multiple resources. The regular one, system assigned managed identity, is assigned only to that resource, and it can't really be pinned to anything else. So the way you can think about it broadly is, if I have a resource and I always want that resource to have one and only one identity within my environment, system assigned. If I have one resource, but I want that identity associated with it to be able to work across multiple resources and assign to multiple resources, then you can go ahead and use user assigned managed identity.
Right. Like I think about it here. For instance, you can see I have 4 different Azure Automation accounts here. Office 365, a demo, a production one. When I did system assigned, this one, that intelligent demo that we were just looking at, I can only use it on this runbook. I could go create that user assigned, go set one up, and then I could use that same identity across all 4 or all 3, however many I wanted to, of these automation accounts. So I'm not having 3 separate identities in the system assigned case where I have to go manage permissions of all of them. I can set up those permissions, use them across all of my automation accounts, and just have that one managed identity that I'm using for all of them. Maybe it's 3 automation accounts that all have to access Office 365 for some reason, and I just want to have like that single managed identity for all those authentications.
Yep, that's it.
So in this case, like we said, we have a system assigned. I'm blurring out the object ID, the principal, but this is that same intelligent demo service principal that was showing up earlier. If I would go, I actually can't remember if I gave it any role assignments or not. Let's go back. Probably could have just searched at the top too. There's that enterprise application. Again, you can go through, see that there's actually no permissions that I've given this managed identity yet. On the other side of it, if we went back into that automation account and I wanted to grant that managed identity some rights, I could go in to the demo where we saw it before. I could go into identity. I can just assign them right from here, and it'll go in, pop up that resource account, and I can go in and start just adding role assignments to this managed identity so it can go access Key Vault, whatever it may be that I want this particular managed identity to access and the role I want it to have. So that's one thing. It's just like going in and setting up a AD user or setting up permissions, those rights for AD users. Same type of thing happens for managed identities. A lot of times, if you go in the other way, you go into an Azure resource, go into assign permissions there in the identity and access management. You can go search for a managed identity and select it, going in kind of that other way as well. So one thing that I found kind of nifty, and this is a new feature that came out. I've used automation accounts for a long time. I've been using these for years to run PowerShell scripts. The way I always used to do this is I would actually go into these credentials, and you can see I've created some different credentials in here. This is a stored username, password. I can't see the password. I can't get to it. And I could use these stored credentials, and when I would go in to PowerShell or into Azure Automation, write some PowerShell to connect to an account, I can go retrieve these credentials. And we should maybe go back to what that looks like. We've been talking about automation, PowerShell. Within here, I have these runbooks. You can think of these as essentially different PowerShell scripts. I have a bunch of different ones in here dealing with term sets and SharePoint fields and credentials and getting host names and provisioning Office 365 groups. All kinds of different PowerShell scripts. So this is one, Scott, that's kind of interesting. I created this sample runbook. And if we go look at it, it's literally just PowerShell. I could do a get host name in here. There's no type ahead. There's nothing like that.
There's no type
It's
ahead. It's not a great debugging
it's not a
experience
great
either.
editing experience.
I think you have to think ahead to editing. You have to think about ahead to the whole run state and debug as well.
Yeah,
So things don't always, like, you can't count on a script that you wrote on your desktop and using the same set of the same set of commandlets running the exact same way in Azure Automation. Like I've seen people have a lot of trouble transitioning maybe from local desktop to interacting with a say you're like interacting with a file, like you've got a CSV that's in the same directory as the script that you execute. Then how do you do that same thing up in Azure, and what does that look like? Do I need to download a file from blob storage, and then where does that get stored, and how do I reference the path within Azure Automation to get it back? For anybody who's been around for a while, like if you ever did like VB script or things like that, or maybe you did anything like where you I always think of it as like response.write debugging, where you start going in and you're just doing like, hey, I'm going to write some output back, or write back to, like, even write output, write host, or kind of weird within Azure Automation. So you got to watch.
one that you brought up, the write host, is a perfect example. Write host does not work in Azure Automation. It'll throw errors. You have to use write output in Azure Automation. Goofy things like that. I found some goofy things too with like setting SharePoint list items. They return a value, but it causes an error in automation. So you have to do like an out null when you write to a SharePoint list.
Yep.
Goofy things like that. But this is the way I always used to do it, is right here, I'm getting that automation PowerShell credential, that demo cred from right here. And I don't know if you've ever played with this, Scott. You can this may be letting on a little known secret that maybe admins don't want me to tell. If you ever did like a get credential and typed in a username and password and stored it in a variable, this same process works. It's secure to a certain extent, but if you actually run these two lines after your stored credential, and I can show you in a test pane here, it actually spits out the password in plain text. So you can go through.
Yeah,
You can run
it's a weird experience, but you can store those credentials all over the place. Like
Right.
you don't even have to have a credential credentials are pretty powerful in Azure Automation. Like it could be a certificate, it could
Yep,
be something that's over in Key Vault. Like it doesn't have to be just plain text, username,
right.
password kind of thing.
But it does do that. So storing them in credentials, even using like a credential in Key Vault, if you're going and converting it into a PowerShell credential, um, I think the same thing would work to pull it out. So certificate-based authentication is definitely more secure. But now what I've started seeing, and I don't know how many modules this applies to, but the latest the latest Exchange Online Management module came out recently, 2 months ago. It was 3.0. This functionality used to be, it was in some of the previews, the 2.0.6 previews. But within Exchange Online now, if you do connect to Exchange Online, you'll notice one of the options you can now pass in here is a managed identity. So I think as more and more people are writing some of these PowerShell scripts, running them in Azure Automation, leveraging these managed identities in Azure Automation, you're starting to see this become an option for connecting to different Microsoft 365 services.
Yeah, I think that like it's nice to see it coming to M365, especially because the identity plane's the same, at least as far as Azure AD and things like that. MIs have been kicking around for some time across, because they're an Azure construct. So they've been kicking around across Azure services pretty much on the regular for a while now. So you should have broad support for saying like, hey, I'm going to use a managed identity with something like functions or VMs or VM scale sets, a whole bunch of PaaS services, like all the data services, things like that. But to have it coming to M365 services, like in the form of things like, hey, let's manage Exchange from this automation account with a managed identity, like that's pretty nifty.
It really is. And I've been playing with this recently more with a client I was working with. There are some things you need to do in order to get it set up and supported. So you'll notice, like when I went into my managed identity, I didn't have any permissions for it. And if you go into a managed identity and go into like assign roles, so for instance, down here, if we go into our identity and assign Azure role permissions, not there, add role assignment, I'm selecting a scope. This is all Azure based. Like this is not
Yep.
M365 based at all. As far as I know, there is not yet a way to do this through the portal. Maybe I haven't tried going into the service principal and the enterprise apps and doing it. You may be able to do it there, but one of the first things you actually need to do is there is a app role in Azure AD essentially, because it ties into Microsoft 365, where it's Exchange manage as app. And you have to go in and assign that permission to that managed identity. I'd have to dig, like it's been kind of iffy of, can you do it? Everybody just gives you PowerShell. So that's the way we're going to do it today, since we're doing PowerShell anyways. So the first thing you'd have to do is go grab this object principal ID. And you have to know what that is in order to give it the right permissions. And here's that script. So this is, now I'm going to give away, I've been masking it the whole time. This is that service
You
principal
tried.
ID, right? I can go delete my managed identity and create a new one anyways. So you need to go in and set up that service principal ID for that managed identity. Principal ID, it's the exact same thing. So you can put it in there twice, and we can put this code in the show notes as well. But then you go get a resource ID. These are hard-coded. This is the app ID for Exchange Online. This is the app role ID for that manages app. And then you can go assign that service principal those permissions. So I'm already connected to the Microsoft Graph PowerShell. We talked about that in an earlier video. But if I would go over here into PowerShell, pass this in, apparently my connection to the graph timed out. There we go. Now I'm connected. Go set up my parameters, go assign that role. That goes in and gives it the Manage as app. So if I would jump back over now to, let's just open up a brand new window so I don't lose where I am there, and jump back into Azure Active Directory, and where we talked about that IntelliJink demo managed identity before, I can go in now and look at the permissions, and I now have that new Office 365 Exchange Online Manage as app permission for that managed identity. So this is the first part of it. Then, again, depending on what you want to do in Exchange, you may also have to make that managed identity global admin. Or not a global admin, sorry, an Exchange admin in Office 365. And that's what the second one does. So this just goes and gets the role ID of that Exchange administrator. Principal ID, again, you have to update that to be your managed identity. So principal ID there, and this we can post as well, but now I can go in there, copy and paste that in, and now that managed identity is an Exchange Online, an Exchange admin. So as I go into my Azure automation account now and write a new runbook, and we're going to go create a new runbook. Oh, you know what? Before we do that, before we do all of that as well, there's modules. Forgot to mention this important part, Scott. Not only do you need permissions, you need the right modules there. These are
You do, and you need the right versions of the
yes.
modules, and you need to think about how you potentially update module versions within a given automation account. I think this is something I've seen folks do too. They create one automation account and they don't think about module lifecycle management and different versions of modules. So you might have dependencies on maybe an older version or things like that, and you go ahead and somebody does an update on the automation account, and then all of a sudden you come back and you go like, why did all my stuff stop working? Because you took a dependency on a particular version or things like that.
Yep.
So you do have to be careful.
So you can see I already have the Exchange Online Management module installed. The nice thing is you can do a couple things. You can go click Add a Module, and it will allow you to browse for a file. If you've written your own modules for PowerShell, you can go ahead and upload them right into your account. But you can also browse from the gallery, and this is just that PowerShell gallery. So if I would go out here and search for Exchange Online Management and make sure I spell it right, it's going to pop that module up. This is the exact same thing as doing an install-module, Exchange Online Management, if you're running PowerShell on your local machine. And now not only do you need to think through the module version, and you can see this one is that 3.0 that has managed identity, you also have to start thinking of runtime version, because now you can do, I still have 7.1, Azure Automation 7.2 should show up any day, or you can do 5.1. This is another one of those between local machine, especially if you're on Windows, and Azure Automation that I found is 7.1 and 5.1 act differently in Azure Automation. So to your point earlier, Scott, I've had some 5.1 modules that I have written. Well, it's actually been more the other way. Modules that run in 7.1 on your local machine, especially in Windows, you go run them in 7.1 in Azure Automation, and they don't work because I think sometimes Windows particularly has the ability to pull in some different aspects that only work in 5.1 under the covers of 7.1. And then when you go to Azure Automation, it doesn't have quite everything there that you normally have with Windows. So I have had very interesting results sometimes with different modules in the whole 7.1 versus 5.1. Exchange Online in particular tends to work better in 7.1. So you can go install that and it'll actually show both modules now. So I'll have a 2.0 module here and a 7.1 module running 3.0 will show up right next to it. Down here, it starts getting all kinds of goofy because you have kind of this mixed environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's intentionality. So,
Right.
there's some things that you probably wouldn't do in your local environment, like pin yourself to a version of a module or a release that you might want to do in your automation account just to make your life a little bit easier and make things a little bit more idempotent so that when you run them, they're going to run in the same state that they ran on the previous try.
Yeah, and I would maybe, again, a production environment, maybe you create those two automation accounts, one that is dedicated to just 5.1, another one that's dedicated to just 7.1. You split up runbooks between the two different ones versus maybe having them mixed like I do in here, thinking through all of that. Because now I can go do this and we'll just do like an Exchange Online demo. And we've been talking about PowerShell. You can actually do Python. You can do some workflow stuff. We're just going to stick with PowerShell. This again, we're going to do 7.1 and go in and create this new runbook. So now I want to go connect to Exchange Online and we can go do a connect. I've got to remember this command now because I didn't save this one, Scott. It's connect Exchange Online.
Well, while you're remembering that, I think it's good that you actually went through this order of operations, like spending a little bit of time on modules. Just something for everybody to keep in mind is that role propagation can take a couple minutes within Azure AD sometimes. So you can't just go and say, okay, I'm going to make this an account an Exchange administrator and then come 5 seconds later and expect it to work 100% of the time. So just keep that in mind too, that you might need like a little 2 to 5 minute pause depending on Azure AD replication and what's going on, just for role propagation to go through before things like this start to really work after you've done identity assignment to a role, things like that.
Yep. That and these modules with the whole timing, the modules can also take a little while to install. So you may have seen when we went in and looked at the demo and the modules that it said that one was installing. You may have to give it some time to install. It is showing that it's available now. You can see it's 3.0, it's 7.1. And I did have to go look it up. I couldn't remember, Scott. It's connect to Exchange Online. You just throw in -managed identity and then the organization with your dot on Microsoft. I have not tried this using like my custom domain because this is still kind of that primary tenant ID. I think you need to continue to use that dot on Microsoft one.
Yeah, I mean it's a known quantity for every
Yep.
Azure Active Directory that exists out there.
But I did that now, so I just did a simple one. Connect Exchange Online, managed identity. I don't need to know the name of it. I don't need to know any username stuff, password stuff. This is saying just use that system assigned or that user assigned, that managed identity that is on this account and go connect to this organization. If you had
Yep,
multiple
which
user
you've
assigned,
previously
you
granted
could pass in a
permissions to.
string of the name of it. But we're going to go test this all out, Scott. We can go to the test pane and go ahead and start and see if I get all my mailboxes back. or if I get errors. Fingers crossed. It's queued up. Speed of the cloud. Running.
That's it. We're running at the speed of the cloud now.
Refresh the job streams. I have broken it. It's still running. That article too had that extra like the get access token. Oh, I failed, Scott.
Did you misspell exchange?
Yup, Exchange something.
Yeah, I mean, this is why you potentially write these things first locally, and then you do a little bit of the
Yes.
copy pasta thing, and then you try and see what needs to change to make them run in Azure Automation.
Yeah, I write most of mine locally, and I actually put them up to GitHub. This is another cool thing. Well, that's running. If you go down to source control over here, you can actually connect your automation account to source control and have it suck um, those PowerShell runbooks right in from GitHub, from DevOps, whatever you want. So, truth be told, most of these, except for the one we were just running and a couple others, when you go look at these runbooks, are actually stored out in GitHub. Couple reasons. One, it's easy to edit them on prem, save them, push them out, have some type of source control on there. The other reason I started doing this, there was one point in time when I was going to give a presentation and went to clean it up and deleted the wrong runbook that I had authored in my automation account, and there is no way to get it back. If you don't have it saved locally, it's gone. There's no recycle bin or soft delete when it comes to these runbooks.
Yeah,
Look at that.
can be a little bit rough like that sometimes.
So yeah, just like that, used my managed identity, connected to Exchange Online, and went in and pulled a bunch of mailboxes back.
Just that easy.
Just that easy. Again, to my knowledge, Exchange Online is the only one that I have seen this show up in yet. I don't know if it's in like the Connect MG graph yet or not, but I'm hoping as this gains usage that you'll start being able to just use managed identity everywhere for these scripts.
Yeah, I'm trying to
Look.
see kind of where else it's connected to today.
Connect MG graph. Oh, that's using
If
service.
if it wasn't in MG Graph, to the point we kind of started out with, where you have multiple versions of managed identities, you have both the system assigned and user assigned. You
Yep.
could always do user assigned managed identity, get everything up and running under that, and then because those are just service principles at the end of the day, like you can still do the kind of connectivity back and forth using just app ID and client secret, and get all that going, and make the transition later if you wanted to, if it wasn't there on day one, kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't see managed, at least in these examples, it's just client ID and secret. Um, I turn get help. Here's other commands you should learn. Get help.
I think as long as you could obtain an access token, like get a bearer token somehow, you should be okay.
Yeah.
A REST method, and have that run and do what it needs to, because then you're just standard PowerShell with passing a bearer token along in the header at that point.
Yep. And I wonder, I mean, because we're using that app ID, can you go in and set like certificates on a managed identity and use cert-based auth with a managed identity? I have never tried that.
I've never tried. I think if I was going to do cert-based auth, I don't know that I'd want to kind of mix the world that way. like certificates tend to be longer running things, and like maybe you don't want to do that in that context. With the whole idea that really managed identity is like if you go in the default state, it is a system assigned managed identity, and it's absolutely pegged to the life cycle of the resource that instantiated the identity. And you might want something like a certificate for authentication to last longer than that.
Yes, that is a good point. So that is one of my recent discoveries and recent, guess new things I'm implementing is when I'm going out and connecting to Exchange Online specifically, um, or anywhere I can, it's starting to try to use those managed identities instead of using stored credentials somewhere. For a
Yeah,
lot of those
it,
benefits
it's
you talked
it's not
about.
a bad practice to do if you can pull it off. Like if it's within the if it's within the constraints of the services that you're deploying, like it's super easy to get on board with.
Yep, for sure. All right.
Well, I
Uh,
posted some other links in the chat for you too. If you if because I always like adding to your list at the end of the day for some of the other services and things that support this.
ooh, look at we had someone joined us too from our Discord for membership. They did say the watch together feature is quite buggy in the web version of Discord. So we will have to make sure we post YouTube links directly too, so they're a little easier to find.
So in Discord, yeah, I think the watch thing is a little bit wonky. So it seems like the chat works. Hopefully everybody can see the chat and things there. But the video hits like a loop and it just starts, you see the jitter while it's going back and forth. I just uh, clicked on the title of in the YouTube player, and that just opened it up in a web browser, and
Oh,
it's
got it.
actually been fine on the YouTube side. But I think it's nice to have kind of the Discord chat and all those kinds of things there.
Yeah, for sure. I have. Is there a chat in the watch in the together feature? We're kind of done with our topic now. I did not. Is there a chat
There
in
is.
the? Come I don't
Yeah, I
see it.
turned one on. I've been posting links in there.
Oh, where is? Why don't I? Oh, there it is. I found the show chat button up in the very upper right hand corner. Sweet. Yeah, that is handy to have. And I know there was some jitter too. I just got a message that my internet connection got a little buggy there for a minute and it dropped my quality.
Yeah, we'll blame it on the incoming hurricane.
Yeah, that was. I had no idea that was coming. I don't know that anybody did. I was sitting here the other day and all of a sudden it pops up on my phone and it was like tropical storm watch for your area and just kind of out of the blue. So we can blame it on that because it is a little windy today. I'm watching the trees blow and apparently the internet get a little flaky. So anything else you want to wrap up with, Scott, around Azure automation, managed identity, Exchange Online management? I know it's a little out of what you do day to day with storage, but it was interesting.
I like we do use managed identities all over the place. I think it's interesting to me to see that it's starting to uh, go outside of the Azure ecosystem. One of those weird naming things, right? I hear Azure automation. I'm like, ooh, it's good for Azure kind of thing. So it's interesting to see it kind of break outside those boundaries and start to tie into other systems that leverage just Azure AD as kind of sole source of identity, like M365, O365, all that good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, with that, Scott, back to our day to day jobs, activities, waiting for FedEx to show up with fun packages for me. All of the above.
All right, sounds good.
All
Thanks, Ben.
right. Well, thanks, Scott. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will talk to you on Friday when we record the podcast.